Well, welcome everybody, and wow, a great way to start the day. So I'm going to wait for Commissioner Berman for just a few more minutes. And, I have a little pamphlet that someone gave me of Australian sayings. I left it in my office. It's some really great ones, and I can't remember it. So before, we don't have to put any of this on the official record. We haven't started the meeting yet. No, that's fine. You good? Okay, good. Well, welcome, and I'd like to call the session of the Public Service Commission to order. Secretary Burgess, is there any changes to today's agenda?
There are no changes to the agenda, but there's one clarification. Item 301, which is case 15E0751, also includes case 15E0082, which is a proceeding on the policies, requirements, and conditions for implementing a community net metering program.
Thank you. Okay, before we get started on the formal agenda, because while those of us were sort of thinking it was a mild day in New York City, there was high winds and a maelstrom going on in western New York, and so we had a number of very significant outages. I've asked Mike Warden to give us a brief update. So, Mike, would you just fill us in?
Sure. Good morning, Chair Zibelman and Commissioners. Currently, there are approximately 200,000 customers without electric service throughout New York State. Most of these customers are in western New York, the Buffalo, Rochester, and metropolitan areas. Probably the hardest hit areas in Monroe County, where there are over 100,000 outages at this time. And that's about a third of the customers in Monroe County, so that's pretty significant, obviously. The Monroe County EOC is open, and RG&E has provided round-the-clock staffing at that EOC. There's another one, I believe it's Warren County, just opened this morning as well. The utilities are reporting significant tree and pole damage in most heavily impacted areas. There are a number of transmission lines down, but to our knowledge, none of them are affecting customers at this time, but they're still very critical to get that work done. The winds were severe enough that they tipped over empty tractor trailers, and they actually caused a freight train derailment in Batavia. There are a large number of schools closed today, and the utilities are holding mutual assistance calls, which is part of the regular practice. Now, this storm actually started west of New York. In Michigan, for example, there are over 800,000 customers without power as of this morning. So there are significant power outages going on through a wide region. That makes mutual assistance challenging, but the New York utilities have been responding. NYSEG and RG&E have approximately over 500 line crews already working on this restoration, and they have another over 200 line crews en route to the Rochester and surrounding areas. National Grid has about 900 line crews working on restoration, and they have another 118 crews or 118 workers in transit. So that process will continue. We actually had a call with the utility executives this morning, first thing. Commissioner Sarah joined us on that call where we reiterated our support for them getting the crews they needed to restore service in a timely manner. Obviously, this time of year, even though we're starting to get towards spring, we still have cold temperatures, so it's important to get power restored to houses so that they have, warm conditions in their house and they don't have to stay out of their house any longer than necessary. We will continue to provide updates through the duration of the event and monitor restoration activities, and that's basically a snapshot of where we're at right now.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate the work of the downstate utilities to supply the mutual assistance. It's moments like this, we're really appreciative of the fact that we have a regional approach. Are there any questions for Mike on this? Diane? No? All right, and I apologize to everyone. I'm suffering from a cold. You can blame it on my granddaughter. I do. So, we're going to move on to then the regular agenda. The first item today is 301, which John Sorensen likes to call our Star Wars case, our Vader order. And it's in the matter of the value of distribution energy resources. Scott Weiner is going to be presenting that to us today. Ted Kelly, our assistant counsel, Peter Olmsted, manager for strategic engagement, and Warren Myers, our director of Office of Market and Regulatory Economics, are also available for questions. So, Scott, please begin.
Thank you, Chair Zibelman and Commissioners Sayre and Berman. Over the course of the last week or more, the team and I have had an opportunity to brief each of you on a number of occasions, so I know you're familiar with the contents of the order, and I'm going to take, even for me, just a few minutes to provide an overview of this order, its significance, and some of its major components. At the outset, I want to acknowledge the staff team that made this possible. Like every item that the Commission and the Department works on, all components of the Department, all staff areas work on them and make valuable contributions. For the past 14 months, a team of Warren Myers, Peter Olmsted, Marco Padula, and Ted Kelly worked along with me what seemed like round the clock to make this possible, and I want to acknowledge their efforts. I also want to acknowledge the contribution made by NYSERDA, our sister agency, and particularly David Sandbank and Carl Moss, who made contributions all along the way directly and with their teams. But this could not have all been accomplished, this order and what it stands for, by staff's efforts alone. At the outset of this proceeding, we invited parties to put aside their fundamental differences and to work on a practical common ground, stressing areas of fundamental agreement and principles to materially improve and build upon the current status quo and advance the shared vision of REV. In looking back at some of the comments that were submitted, I want to quote one set of comments because I think it captures the spirit of the past year. These commentators said, all parties showed grace and compromise, recognizing the limits of what could be done in such a short period of time on such complex issues, but also recognizing that reform was underway, as difficult as it may be. And that commitment to REV and the commitment to the market and vision by REV made today possible in today's order. I want to touch upon and call out some of the outcomes from this order. Significantly, the order before you actualizes the fundamental policy contained in REV that accurate pricing and compensation of distributed energy resources is essential to achieve the goals of REV, most notably to be able to capture and compensate for the benefits provided to the distribution system and thereby provide price signals that will lead to the investment in and the deployment of DER resources that will enable the bidirectional and transactive load environment that stands at the heart of New York's vision. The order articulates also the foundational policy that withdrawal of demand is of equal value to that of injections. And as discussed further in the order, that goal, that policy, is one that becomes a North Star. Technological and other regulatory realities today prevent its full application, but that's a guiding principle that will take us into the future. Significantly, this order initiates the first step, the interim methodology towards the transition where full value will be able to be obtained. The order establishes the schedule that ends new enrollments in net energy metering and thereby will end new enrollments in that mechanism. And the order notes that while NEM has served as a foundational pillar for the emergence of solar and other forms of distributed generation, it obscured the accuracy evaluation, resulting in inadequate and imprecise signals. that served as a deterrent to investment. The order initiates the application of the new, I call it VDER methodology. We may run a contest to name this methodology, but it initiates its application. And it initiates in a way of measured steps to launch the mechanism in order to provide for the first stage of more accurate compensation. The order confirms the ability of all generators to obtain certificates for environmental attributes and to retire those certificates in compliance with Green E and similar sustainability programs. The order speaks loudly about the Commission's continued commitment to low-income customers, particularly in areas of energy affordability and access to distributed energy resources. And finally, the order establishes further proceedings, including the commencement of Phase 2 of this proceeding. A quick note on procedural history. This particular proceeding responds to the Commission's directive to develop an interim methodology for more precise and accurate valuation and the accompanying compensation methodology. This direction has been rooted in the Commission's work since the inception of REV and was discussed in Tracks 1 and 2, the Community DG Order, and most recently and most forcefully in the Orange and Rockland Floating Cap Order. The initial focus, according to the Commission's direction, is to transition from net energy metering, and therefore the work during this interim phase was limited to technologies which qualified for the net metering compensation mechanism. However, the order discusses that the principle of technology neutrality and the inclusion of all DR technologies is an essential element of the Phase 2 proceedings. This particular proceeding was initiated in December of 2015. Staff was directed to produce and present the Commission with a recommended methodology by December of 2016, and staff issued its report for public comment in October of 16. This was, as I alluded to, and I think anybody who's observed it, certainly those that have participated, know this is a uniquely successful, collaborative, and transparent process. Over a period of 10 months, there were numerous workshops, technical conferences, collaborative conferences to discuss the issues and options with all stakeholders. Anybody who wanted to attend the meetings were welcome. There were questions that framed the discussion. We invited proposals from all interested participants. Those proposals were presented and debated among the participants. To facilitate the consideration of options, staff began to offer what we call discussion straw proposals that helped frame the discussion, and then we issued our report. After the report was issued, 35 parties submitted initial comments, 26 reply comments, and we've received over 3,000 public comments in this matter. And while differences have been expressed certainly on the details, I think it's clear to say that a consensus was adopted about the importance and the design of the value stack and the tranche system, which I'll describe in a minute, excuse me, as the foundation of the new methodology. This order articulates fundamental policy decisions that establishes the basis for the implementation of the interim VDR tariff, or what we call the Phase 1 VDR tariff, and it's coupled with additional opportunities for a slightly revised net energy metering opportunity to aid in the transition and avoid market disruptions. I want to spend just a minute talking about the continuation of the net metering mechanism. I know of concern to all those that have systems installed today that this order grandfathers all interconnected systems, and those will continue on under the current statutory scheme for the life of the system. However, the continuation of the net metering mechanism for new installations is now established under the new VDR tariff that is contained and will be implemented through this order. We call that Phase 1 NEM. Phase 1 NEM is the exact same compensation as the existing NEM. There's no difference. The compensation is exactly the same. The one difference is it is limited in time. So for all systems that are enrolled in Phase 1 NEM, that mechanism will be available for 20 years from the point of operation for small mass market systems. For larger systems like community DG and other commercial on-site systems, that period will be 25 years, and the order goes into great detail explaining why that difference occurred. The switch over to Phase 1 NEM is going to be based upon an objective criteria. We wanted to avoid any uncertainty and factual disputes as to when the switchover occurred. After taking a look at the new SIR methodologies that were adopted by the Commission next month for interconnection of solar systems and other DG systems, the order adopts a framework where all projects that have finished construction as of today will be eligible for NEM. All projects that have not finished construction by today but are otherwise eligible for net metering will use the new Phase 1 mechanism. And again, the only difference, the compensation is exactly the same. So then the question is, how did we suggest that we determine whether or not a project is completed construction? And there's a process through which, when a project is in fact done with construction, the utility is notified in writing, and the transmittal of that letter asking for the utility to come and inspect will be the objective indicator that construction's been completed. We recognize that some projects could have reached that stage today or yesterday, and that the letter is sitting on someone's desk. We didn't want that to be a snag, so we built in a 7-day grace period to submit the letter. CDG projects and larger on-site remote projects will also be able to utilize Phase 1. There will be a more limited opportunity than mass market. For mass market, enrollment will continue until January 1, 2020. So all projects that have completed and have been interconnected by January 1, 2020 will be eligible to enroll in the Phase 1 NEM methodology. This was done, in this transition period, was established in recognition of the maturity of that market segment and the accompanying established business practices, as well as some technical constraints that would not permit today universal metering and measuring to the detail that would be needed for the value stack. For CDG projects and larger on-site remote projects, that period is much shorter. It's limited to the first 90 days following the order, and it's also limited in the number of megawatts that can be enrolled, and there is an allocation procedure for each service territory that I'll discuss in a minute. The order also reflects the Commission's concern about being able to manage the potential bill impacts that could come from the actions taken in this order. Phase 1 NEM and the VDR compensation mechanism will impact customers' bills because of reduced revenues and surcharge collections. Staff had recommended, and this order adopts, what we describe as a 2% ceiling that would be determined for each service territory. So limiting potential bill impacts to 2% for the application of Phase 1 NEM as well as the CDG projects. In a nutshell, what the order discusses in much greater detail is we calculated out what this 2% ceiling would look like for each service territory that yielded the number of megawatts over the course of this Phase 1 period. And those megawatts were then allocated first to assure there was a sufficient allocation to sustain the level of installations unique to each service territory that's occurred over the past 2 years. So market activity is sustained. And for CDG, it allocates along tranches, and these tranches represent a portion that will be eligible for Phase 1 NEM, and then other tranches that will be available for inclusion, but ever reducing amounts of a market transition credit. The fundamental construct that's presented by this order is the value stack in tranches during phase one. The value stack is the term used for the aggregation of specific value components. And we anticipate that over time and in phase two and in the years that follow, the number of components will increase and the granularity of each component will increase, achieving the type of specificity and precision and accuracy that we strive for. Recognizing that this phase one is just the first step, the methodology balances granular and variable pricing with the recognized need for stability and predictability for project development in this first phase. Implementation of the value of DR tariff is based on policies established by this order. This order establishes all the policies necessary to implement the value stack and tranche system. Now that these policies will have been adopted by the Commission, assuming you vote on it, of course, then the utilities will be able to provide the data that responds to those policies that allows the final calculations for the value stack. That will occur during the coming months, and I want to stress that activity is objective and will involve periods of stakeholder consultation and comment before it comes back to the Commission. Excuse me, but we expect that should be able to take place so that by this summer, the Commission will be in a position to consider the recommendations and implement the value stack. As I mentioned, for Community DG, there's also a system of tranches, and the idea around these tranches is to allocate a development opportunity in such a way that the market transition credit, which is provided as a transition catalyst to enable the development of projects, will gradually step down over time. And the allocation of megawatts into the tranche system is all within this 2% incremental bill impact ceiling the Commission established, and the details of that are set forth in the order. I want to note that this approach was first proposed in the collaborative through the SPP team that was made up of the joint utilities and a few of the solar companies. That proposal in and of itself was not accepted, but that concept had become the foundation for future discussions and eventually became the consensus tool. Lastly, I want to talk about the further proceedings that are called for in the order. First, I want to mention phase two. That will start with a gathering of the parties, either in a procedural conference or another planning conference that will be held in May 17, May of this year. The order sets forth certain priority topics, including but certainly not limited to the inclusion of non-NEM technologies in phase two, improving the value stack components, and various rate design issues. Importantly, the order articulates that staff should not wait until the end of the phase two discussions to present recommendations, and the Commission invites the recommendations as soon as they are ready. And I know that staff and the parties appreciate that opportunity. Secondly, the order calls for the utilities each to file work plans to unbundle values. Those work plans need to be filed in 45 days. The order spends a good amount of time discussing the importance of this data and that this is data and information which is uniquely in the hands of the utilities, and having access to this data in a transparent way will not only enable the development of increased granularity of values, but will also provide the opportunity for market participants to actively participate more than in just the vetting of that data, but also the opportunity to suggest other values and other products that may be appropriate. Next to last, another further proceeding will take a look at cost reduction measures that can be initiated to help bring down the cost of project development for Community DG. These include such things as consideration of increasing the size of a project, which is now capped at 2 megawatts, looking at new or redesigned incentives from the Green Bank in terms of financing, New York Sun in terms of its megawatt block program, and use of CEF funds, all to complement the advent of the value stack tariff and drive further CDG development. And lastly, I just want to mention that staff is planning to conduct at least one webinar in the latter part of this month in order to provide an opportunity for interested stakeholders to get a much more detailed explanation of the order. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. I think in the interest of sparing everybody my horrible voice, I'm just going to keep my comments very short and turn it over to Commissioner Sarah and Commissioner Berman. So, first of all, I want to note my appreciation to the staff team that developed both the white paper and then subsequently have worked with the collaborative. I do want to echo Scott's comments at the beginning. You know, there are many, many, many jurisdictions, both domestically and internationally, are trying to figure out how do we move forward with distributed energy resources, how do we move forward with renewables in a way that's more market-oriented and make a transference from existing subsidies to a much more market-oriented approach. And in many jurisdictions, these conversations have been highly disruptive. We've had warring parties on either sides. People haven't talked, and it ends up, you know, in a compromise that often is probably the worst of all outcomes for all parties, because it ends up being in situations where no one really can develop a business. It's just a patchwork. I think that the parties who were part of this case, the relationships that were formed among the distributed energy resource providers and the utilities and the staff, and I include within that the NYSERDA folks who really were with us the whole way, have been really sort of demonstrable of the way things can get done. And I remarked that, you know, in the beginning people sat on other sides of the room, and it was always clear if you walked into a collaborative who were the utilities and who were the DER providers and where was the staff. And by the end, it became very unclear as who was on what side, because it was a real conversation as opposed to a debate. And so I'm very appreciative to the fact that people did work together and they did try to find common ground and I think most importantly recognize that this was about consumers fundamentally, and we were trying to find the right solution for consumers. So I think that there's should be noted as to how New York has been able to start this process of solving very challenging issues. For my purpose, this pricing issue is one of the critical issues for REV. It's something we identified in Track 1. We talked about it again in Track 2. The experience in other regions, such as Hawaii, such as Germany, such as Spain, such as California, has been that people were developing clean energy, and then they realized they had an issue in terms of how to manage systems very differently. And one of the things that they learned is that they had things that people called the camels and the duck problem, where they weren't really thinking about the system, and as a result, they ended up spending a lot more money than they needed to, or ended up having to develop a lot more fossil generation than they wanted to, because they weren't really thinking about how the system works. And one of the things that we know about electricity is that it obeys not the laws of contract, but it obeys the laws of physics. And we really have to design our markets and our systems based on those laws first and foremost, because that's how you're going to get the most efficient outcome. Now, that being said, I think government has a very important role in understanding that the laws of physics and markets, which is how our markets are designed, isn't sort of the end-all and be-all. There are very important policy issues that have to accompany that, because, after all, electricity does remain an essential service. And we have to make sure that as we are proceeding, we're proceeding in a thoughtful and deliberate manner that doesn't have unintended consequences. And so in all the actions I think we've taken in REV is to recognize where we want to go, that if we're thoughtful, we can avoid the problems, and that distributed energy resources, rather than being a problem that we have to solve for, can be a solution to the issues that we want to get to, which is a clean energy future. And that really does then start with understanding that the current mechanisms that we use to price these resources are truly a blunt instrument and don't really show the full value that distributed energy resources can have on the system. And that includes not just peak shaving, which I think is very important, but also load shifting. As we move towards more cleaner energy, we're going to see that the demand for energy is going to go higher at night, when today it peaks in the afternoon. Not the demand, but the resources are going to be available better at night, and so we need to be able to shift our demand to when the resources are available, which is another value that DER can provide. It can provide stability for the grid. It can provide reactive power. It can provide fast response. All those things that are going to be really, really important as we think about moving to a much less carbon-intensive electric sector. And so understanding that and getting that value articulated so that third parties and customers can invest in the systems that provide the highest value to the grid was a very critical component of RED from the get-go. And we said that with an understanding that, in just saying that doesn't really solve the problem. We really need to think through how we're going to get there. And so in my mind, the order solves and does do a lot of the things that the Commission said they wanted to achieve. One was to recognize that net energy metering has played a very important role in providing a stable business for qualified resources, and that we wanted to preserve the good things about net energy metering as we move forward. The second, and this is another important role I think government plays, is that we need to provide a certain amount of certainty and a certain amount of ability for businesses to adjust. And so we need to not just simply say we're going to change. And so the problems that folks had in Arizona and Nevada, where they just totally upset the entire industry, was something we deliberately wanted to avoid in New York. And I think the order does that by having a very sensible transition to where we want to go. And then the third piece is really is looking at how to price these resources accurately, understanding all of the value the distributed energy resources can have to the system, and getting us to a place, along with the other orders we're going to be dealing with today, to really start in executing so that we can have a system that is truly two-way, one that looks at the ability to manage demand that on an equal basis as being able to inject supply. And I think that's sort of the heart of this order is moving us in that direction. That being said, I also appreciate the fact that one of the things that's going to be very critical for this state as we move forward with adopting more distributed energy resources is access. And, today we have, and we've always had, universal access to supply. We have policies in our state around affordability to make sure that everybody has access to the same types of resources at affordable rate. When it comes to distributed energy resources, access takes on a new meaning. We don't believe that all of the markets are going to mature at the same level. And we want to make sure, and this is one of the things that was certainly underlying our order on community DG, that low-income consumers have access. We have groups that talk about energy democracy. I love that term. And I think giving people choice is very, very important, and it's something we want to pursue in the state. So the other aspect of the order that I appreciate is the recognition that as we move this market forward, we need to make sure that we are not creating haves and have-nots, and there's opportunities for everyone. And if they don't exist, just simply by way of the market, that's where the government needs to intervene. And so I think the order provides the right balance, it provides the right vision, This is complicated. I understand that, not everyone's going to be happy with every aspect of it, but that is sort of why we are here, is to make sure that as we're moving ahead, we stay true to where we want to go. But ultimately, I think that what it represents is really what's very important to New York, which is a recognition that distributed energy resources are a very important part of our energy future. We need to create the markets that make them work. We need to recognize that today, as we sit here, we don't really appreciate the full value that these resources can provide to the system, and we certainly don't want to undercut their value by our innocence. And fourth is that we need to continue to move quickly to recognize that one of the things we don't want to do is create unintended subsidies and put ourselves in a position where there's inequity among various consumer classes, including this new group of consumers we call prosumers and normal consumers. I think we've achieved that balance, and I intend to vote for it. But I really do appreciate the work of the staff team and the parties to help us get there in this very complex matter. So thank you. I'll turn it over to Commissioner Sayre.
This case is a success story, as the chair said and Mr. Wiener said, of the collaborative process. Unlike traditional notice and comment proceedings, where parties hire lawyers to file their litigation positions, we had all interested parties collaborating in this case and ultimately coming up with a framework that nearly everybody can live with and, more importantly, can work with, even if nobody may be wildly happy with the overall result. The collaborative process didn't answer all the questions, and we were left with some hard decisions to make at the commission level to balance the public interest. That's okay, it's what we're paid to do. In these collaborations, we started from a good proposition. It was understood from the very beginning that we want to encourage and increase DERs in New York, not limit them. This order is the beginning of a long process to value all DERs and then move toward compensation at those values. We're being careful and incremental in that process, and we're doing our best not to upset legitimate economic expectations for parties who have already made contracts or are far along in that process, and not to upset the marketplace by making New York uneconomical for new clean distributed energy. But at the same time, we're balancing the interests of non-participating ratepayers to ensure that they're treated equitably and not unduly burdened. All in all, we're taking a large step in this order toward proper valuation of distributed energy resources, and we're carefully explaining our next steps. The value of DER as a concept is at the absolute core of REV, and this order moves our regulatory policies along with the developing markets and technological changes that are happening in this industry. We've got to be careful not to get too far behind, and we've got to be careful not to get too far ahead. So we're a long way from being done here, but I can say we're committed to seeing it through.
Thank you. Commissioner Berman?
Thank you. First, I would also like to recognize those hardworking utility workers and staff who are out there right now dealing with the issues from the storms and the winds, and also to the customers who are experiencing unprecedented wind in those areas. My thoughts are with them, and we're really at an inflection point, and looking at the Value D proceeding, it really came about from the Commission's October 16th, 2015 order, which established the interim ceilings on the interconnection of net metered generation, for what's colloquially known as the floating cap order. It's no secret that I dissented in that order. And I do believe that that is a threshold issue. I've spent a great number of time rereading that order, rereading the comments in that order, and looking at what does this mean for now as it transitions into the value D. The majority opinion in the that order did talk about that this was a floating cap into the transition of value D. So it was an opportunity from that to then look into and start this value D proceeding and address those core issues. So to the extent that the majority opinion is controlling, it moves into now the value D. And so my comments and my dissent in that opinion still stand, except as a threshold matter, I'm going to move beyond that for the purposes of this order, but understanding that the underlying issue of whether or not we had the ability to float the cap and whether or not the record was set in that order is something that is still of concern for me. However, I do see that the value D order is now trying to give some certainty. And as I understand, there really are sort of three now positions, which is the NEM, then Phase 1 NEM, and then value D. And I know that you're going to have, or we're going to have a webinar within the next 30 days. I think it's very important that we do what we've done before, where we give an opportunity for folks to share their questions and comments, and ahead of time, and also after the webinar, because I do believe that the order is very comprehensive, but the wording may need some clarity from the perspective of that people want to make sure that they understand it specifically. It's not that it's not unclear for purposes of the order, but just in terms of what that means. With the NEM, not Phase 1 NEM, I just want to make sure, at least today at session, that people understand what that means for who can be in that, and what it also means for participation in the upcoming April solicitation, and then move on to what it means with Phase 1 specifically, and who can participate, and then with the value D, the value stack, what that means, so that we have a clear understanding to the extent that it's high level, because the devils are in the detail in the order. I think it's important for us to have that conversation now.
Thank you, Commissioner Berman. I'm going to defer the answer to my colleague, Paul Agresta, our Chief Counsel.
What was the question? No. Okay, so I think I'm going to answer the question about the solicitation, and then maybe Ted can answer the rest of it. The solicitation you're referring to, I believe, is the renewable energy standard solicitation that NYSERDA would be doing, we believe, in April. So that's for renewable projects. So under the old RPS system, generally behind-the-meter resources were not eligible, and at one point the Commission did make a small exception and allowed some projects that were getting net energy metering to participate. The restrictions in the RPS program were that the net energy metering project had to be an eligible technology under the RPS program. It couldn't get any money from the customer-cited tier of the RPS program. It couldn't get any money from the New York Sun program. It couldn't get any money from the Clean Energy Fund program incentives. it also had to meet whatever the vintage requirements were. And it was done because there really was no other alternative in the Commission's view for those projects. Here, since there are now going to be alternatives created under the Phase 1 NEM tariff and the value stack tariffs, the order proposes that those projects be no longer eligible to bid in to the Renewable Energy Standard Tier 1 solicitations, with one tiny little grandfathering exception. If the project makes the cutoff for qualifying for pre-existing net energy metering, it would still be eligible to bid into a solicitation under the RES program. We're not sure that there will be any bidders in that category, but by grandfathering them in, there may be one or two projects out there where someone has invested in a project to get it online after January 1, 2015, which is the vintage date, and now, and was planning on going into the next solicitation. They would still be eligible if they make the cutoff. But once we get beyond the cutoff, there'll be no further eligibility for net energy metered projects to bid in. And there is a table on page B1 of the order. It's Appendix B, which lays out who's eligible and who's not. And basically, most of what's coming in under the value of D will not be eligible for bidding in.
And, with respect to how that cutoff works, so projects that are on pre-existing NEM rather than Phase 1 NEM or the value stack, and therefore are potentially eligible for the solicitation if they meet the other requirements that Paul laid out. Those projects will be, first of all, any project that is already fully interconnected in operation as of today, March 9th. And then in addition, any project that has completed construction as of today, with both the utility and the developer having completed construction, and that's in compliance with Step 8 of the standard interconnection requirements for the kind of large projects we'd be talking about for potentially bidding into a solicitation. It's Step 4 for smaller projects. So any project that has completed that construction step, Step 8, and then by today, and then sends a notification to the utility, which is part of Step 9, that all construction is completed within the next 7 days, so that the utility is able to record that they had completed construction by today.
Thank you. I do think that one of the most important parts of this order is that table that Mr. Agresta referenced in B1, because I do think it sort of lays out, as clear as a table can lay out, what we're doing. I also think one of the most important things, second most important thing in the order, is the timeline that's given. Now, I do caution, we did have timeline in the Track 1 order, I believe. Maybe it was the Track 3, but I think it was Track 1. And those timelines were not always followed, not necessarily through anyone's fault, but to the extent that we focus on what it means if we're not keeping to that timeline and making sure that that's revised as appropriate so that we can be laser focused on the next steps on that. There is obviously going to be concern on the fact that we are looking at a hard stop date of today. For those folks who are in the first queue, first NEM, they're grandfathered forever for the life of their project. But there will be those who say that it's unfair that we did this with a hard stop. Do you have any thoughts on that?
A couple. Staff, in making the recommendation, is very sensitive about the issue that you raised. And we felt it was important to try and find an objective event that one could point to. The objectivity of the event would limit the range of dispute. And therefore, as Ted mentioned, we tied the decision into the new SIR queue management process, installation process that the Commission adopted. And one of the concerns was we wanted to go back in the process as much as we could to avoid a very hard stop. One thing we do is build in the 7-day grace period. But we realized that we went back to a little further in the process, that the number of projects that arguably could qualify, in fact, would be more than the allocation in some service territories to stay within the 2% cap. In other words, had we allowed more projects in, there was a very good likelihood in some situations that the Commission's desire to try to manage potential bill impacts would be not undermined, but would be lessened. So we feel that this struck the right compromise. The other issue is, I think it's important, and I don't want to minimize the distinction, but I don't want to make it more than it is either. To me, the important issue is that the compensation is exactly the same. Somebody who's in the existing NEM paradigm and somebody that's in the Phase 1 paradigm will receive exactly the same compensation. The difference is that Phase 1, there'll be that compensation mechanism will operate up to 20 years. Now, I certainly can't predict what's going to happen in 20 years, but one of the assumptions we have is that whatever the compensation mechanism is then, it will be better than NEM, just because of the ability to capture additional values. So the second point I want to make is at the end of the 20 years, the system doesn't lose its value. It doesn't stop being compensated. The mechanism by which it will be compensated will change to the mechanism that is then in effect 20 years hence from the start of its operation.
Okay.
Please.
And I just want to also note that the cutoff decision is consistent with what the majority order of the Commission had said in the floating cap or interim ceiling order, which stated that once there was a new compensation method ready, the ceiling would automatically be set based on the generation currently installed.
Okay, thank you. And then can you talk about, and I think this is to Mr. Weiner, can you talk a little bit about the DER oversight next steps?
Sure. Thank you for mentioning that. There has been a proceeding underway for some time now. It goes under the name of DER oversight, and it is an effort to develop a set of rules for the oversight of DER providers. The Commission anticipated the need for this with the anticipated growth of the DER marketplace, and over a period of time, a number of technical conferences were held, staff recommendations were issued, comments were received on that, and then it was held in abeyance for a number of factors, one of which was a recognition that so much has changed in the DER marketplace and in anticipation of this order that it would be worthwhile to go back and take another look at both the report and the issues that were raised in the report and the draft or the construct of the proposed order. As a result of that, staff concluded it would be good to update its knowledge and the marketplace's knowledge. And this order that you're acting on today directs the issuance of an updated staff report, if you will, or a series of questions that will allow for public comment and then the presentation of an order to the Commission. We're targeting the same time frame as the implementation order, which would be the summer, so that when the implementation order is adopted, the Commission will be in a position to consider adopting an order addressing the rules for DER oversight.
Okay. Do you think the timeline to addressing the DER oversight is realistic?
Yes. Staff have been working on the preparation of the documents that will be submitted for public comment, and that will go out, I believe it's within 30 days.
Okay.
And that will allow for adequate time for public comment and the drafting of recommendations.
Okay. You know that I've been a vocal public proponent of making sure that when we look at things and act, that we're not just operating based on potentially stale comments, and that we make sure that we have a robust current record within which to act. DER oversight is a huge issue needs to be addressed in a timely fashion. It needs to be addressed in an appropriate way. So to the extent that we also make sure that we take those comments that have been there and make sure with the new one that we also don't just look to anyone that may be submitting, but make sure that if they have submitted in the other one, that to the extent they want to continue those same comments or update them, that we really need to be engaged in that so that we don't lose some of the potential relevant information in those as it translates,
Yes.
as well as how it incorporates in this new paradigm.
Yes.
Can you also talk about the low-income collaborative and the next steps on that?
As the chair mentioned, the Commission's commitment to low issues surrounding low-income affordability and access to these technologies is something that permeates the order. And of course, these issues arise in almost every significant decision by the Commission. So what we have proposed here is a number of initiatives, including the pulling together of the work that came out of the low-income collaborative into some initiatives, some of which are raised as for consideration, something we call interzonal CDG development that would be targeted towards low-income membership. There are others, but consistent with your comments just now on DR oversight, what we'll be doing is expanding, not starting a whole new record, and then pulling together a holistic approach that can focus on meeting and fulfilling the expectation, the aspiration of meaningful low-income participation and access to these technologies and market systems.
Okay, thank you. I believe strongly that all of us are committed to addressing low-income issues to the extent that we are able to, and I think this order continues that commitment. I would ask, though, that any such proposal and any potential action that we do really tries to look at holistically all of the different orders, all of the different comments, the proposals that have been out there, and tries to make sure that we incorporate as appropriate and align it and try to maximize the impact. I do know that we have had a number of different low-income collaboratives, working groups, task force, etc. And my concern is making sure that we really drill down. I don't think I've been able to see all of the different, work products that have come out of that, and I'm not saying that they're hidden. I'm just saying that for me, there's a lot there, and needing to make sure that we fully drill down and actually understand what it actually means, and how it actually specifically may be utilized under our jurisdiction to be able to have the most impact for those who are affected. Okay, I will save my comments on energy storage for the next. Sorry. For the next orders where we talk about it, because I think it's appropriate, and I don't, I'm not going to belabor my comments on things that I've talked about before in terms of rev demos and the NEM floating cap order. I think that the pathway forward is here. I think that I don't necessarily agree with every single thing language-wise in the order, but I do think that there is a framework, and I do think that we're now moving into what does this mean. This order primarily addresses the NEM issue, and there is, a need to get more into the actual pricing and the fairness and the compensation issues. I do think that we will need to revisit some of the compensation versus incentive issues in the value stack issue. And so to the extent that it may have landed in some way in preliminary NEM, I don't, and phase one NEM, that we are going to need to take a fresh look. I do also think that there may be some things that are unintended consequences that we didn't necessarily, I guess unintended, right? That we may, right? I mean, there you go. So there may be some consequences that are unintended that we will need to address, and I think that from that, I'm done. Except that I believe that we all need to work together for looking at what this means and taking a hard look and being willing to also listen to those who may have concerns. And that webinar, I think, is a good first step because we all will get a pulse on what is completely understood, what is not, and what some of the issues that may arise from that. So I think that's very important. So thank you.
Do you have anything further? Thank you. Just a couple of observations. One is, I would say that I think the order does do a very good job. It does really focus on the NEM qualified resources. I would have personally preferred that we have completely addressed all resources at this time, but I recognize that there needs to be more work done on that. But the order certainly suggests or states that will be done quickly. I also one point we should again, it's a little odd since I won't be here, but I do think that if I come, it'll be to sit back there and hold up a sign. Or, yeah, I might even borrow a sign. Is that as we're looking at the DER oversight, we keep in mind we're also going to be looking at the ESCO reset, and those two things really ought to dovetail. So I would hope that's kept in mind. With that, let's move to a vote. So, all those in favor of the recommendation to adopt the phased implementation of the value of distributed energy resource tariff as described, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
And I concur based on my comments at session.
And I say aye, so that's hearing no opposition, there being none, the recommendations are adopted. Thank you. One down, 76 more to go. Paul said I should have a good time today, so I intend to. Our next item up is in the matter of distributed system implementation plans. And that's presented by Tammy Mitchell. Mike Warden is also here. And as soon as Tammy gets her seat. Welcome, Tammy.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Zibelman and Commissioners. The draft order before you describes at a high level the distributed system implementation plans filed by the New York State investor-owned utilities and provides utilities with initial direction on near-term actions necessary for distributed system platform progress in certain key areas. As way of background, the Reforming the Energy Vision, or REV Track 1 order, issued in February of 2015, defined a set of functions the utilities would need to develop in order to transition to a dynamic grid model that incorporates distributed energy resources. These functions are called, collectively, the Distributed System Platform, or DSP. The Commission further noted in its Track 1 order that in establishing the DSP, improved utility planning and operations, along with the development of a transactional DER market, were necessary, and the vehicle for defining and implementing these elements would be the Distributed System Implementation Plans, or DSIPs. In its April 2016 DSIP guidance order, the Commission required 3 utility filings: a joint utility filing describing a plan and timeline for stakeholder engagement to help inform the DSIPs, an initial DSIP to be developed and filed separately by each of the individual utilities, and a supplemental DSIP to be developed and filed jointly by the utilities. The utility stakeholder engagement plan laid out a formal process designed and led by the joint utilities to elicit input from interested stakeholders on a variety of issues to be addressed in the DSIPs. The engagement process involved a number of parties, and in addition to allowing for input into the DSIPs, established a productive working relationship between the utilities and other parties, which will be key to the success of the DSP in meeting the goals of REV. As outlined in the supplemental DSIP, the utilities propose to continue engagement with stakeholders in a number of key areas. The initial DSIPs, filed June 30, 2016, include details about each utility's physical systems, system planning efforts, current tools, evolving practices, and 5-year capital plans. The initial DSIPs point out that the utilities are already deploying or planning to deploy many of the advanced technologies necessary for enabling core DSP functions. The plans were also a first step toward providing customers and other parties with information needed for identifying and characterizing near-term opportunities for DER development in each utility's electric distribution system. The supplemental DSIP, filed November 1, 2016, begins to identify the resources and tools necessary for planning, implementing, and operating a modern grid capable of managing distributed resources and supporting retail markets while operating safely and reliably. In the supplemental DSIP, the joint utilities built on information in the initial DSIPs by describing at a high level their envisioned path and framework for implementing their DSPs using a common framework. According to the initial and supplemental DSIPs, DSP development is progressing in several areas, including tools and processes supporting DER interconnection, advanced distribution monitoring, control, and modeling capabilities, third-party access to useful utility system data and customer energy data, coordination between DSPs and the New York ISO, and a readiness framework for electric vehicles. Comments were received from a wide range of interested entities on both the initial and the supplemental DSIPs. In general, while parties acknowledged the progress made and the information provided in the DSIPs, many commented that additional activity was needed in particular areas. In particular, some parties stated that the DSIPs did not provide sufficient detail necessary for anticipating, monitoring, and evaluating the utility's progress toward DSP implementation over the next few years. The initial and supplemental DSIP filings are the result of significant work and effort by the utilities and interested stakeholders. However, there are certain key activities for which further and quicker action is needed by the utilities to facilitate timely DSP development. The first area is hosting capacity. Hosting capacity describes the total DER output that a part of the electric distribution system can reliably accommodate without need for material upgrades to the system. To enable DER development in the near term, utilities need to identify those areas on the distribution system where adequate hosting capacity exists, and therefore DER can interconnect at a lower cost and in a quicker time frame. The utilities must also focus on substantially increasing the hosting capacity in many locations that are otherwise suitable and attractive for siting DERs. As part of its initial DSIP filing, each utility provided its version of indicator maps that are meant to show those parts of the distribution system that are most favorable for interconnecting DERs. While this was a first attempt at providing system information, the indicator maps fall short of providing the useful information that hosting capacity maps could provide. In the supplemental DSIP, the joint utilities describe a 4-phase plan for developing their hosting capacity analysis. The utilities plan employs a methodology and modeling software developed by the Electric Power Research Institute, or EPRI, and with each phase will produce increasingly complex and informative results. In the first phase, the utilities propose to produce and publish hosting capacity data for one half of their distribution circuits by the end of 2017, and then the remaining half of their circuits by the end of June 2018. As the Commission has indicated previously, hosting capacity information is a critical aspect in facilitating DER penetration and getting DER to the right places on the distribution system. The utilities must advance the capabilities for calculating and presenting hosting capacity data as quickly as possible. And while the phased approach is a reasonable approach, the progress has been unacceptably slow and not supportive of the industry's needs. Furthermore, the utilities have not provided sufficient details about their approaches to prioritizing their hosting capacity evaluations. Therefore, the draft order directs the utilities to develop and publish hosting capacity analysis for all circuits at and above 12 kV by October 1st, 2017. Furthermore, the utilities need to make progress toward providing hosting capacity data not only on all the circuits, but the analysis needs to be dynamic so that it provides the most useful information. The next area addressed is related to interconnection portals. The RevTrack-1 order, in the RevTrack-1 order, the Commission directed each utility to develop an online portal which DER developers will use to apply for interconnection to the utilities grid. In addition to automated processing of application, the Track-1 order required that utilities portal be capable of automatically performing system impact studies in order to issue a decision in a timely manner. Furthermore, implementation of each utilities portal was required by the time of the initial DSIP filings. At the time of the initial DSIP filings, none of the electric utilities had successfully implemented a fully functioning portal, as described in the RevTrack-1 order. However, each utility's initial DSIP provided some insight and information as to the status of the efforts for each utility. To establish a scope and schedule for utilities portal efforts, staff and the utilities engaged EPRI to prepare a functional specification. The supplemental DSIP filing states that the utilities are adopting the report's recommended specifications and are currently moving toward more consistent portal functionality based on those specifications. Again, while the utilities have made some recent progress with the interconnection portal efforts, they have not made enough progress to date. To address the utilities' limited progress in implementing their interconnection portals, the order directs that the utilities ensure that Phase 1 level of portal capabilities is fully implemented by no later than October 1st, 2017. The next area addressed by the draft order is non-wires alternatives, or NWAs. The guidance order required utilities to describe in their initial DSIPs specific areas where infrastructure upgrades are impending or foreseen, and to indicate the potential for DERs to address the forecasted system requirements at those locations. In their initial DSIPs, each utility identified a small number of locations for potential NWAs based on previously proposed screening criteria intended to identify which capital projects would be potential candidates for NWAs. In the BCA framework order, the Commission rejected the utilities' proposed NWA screening criteria as being too conservative. In the supplemental DSIP, the utilities proposed a less conservative, common framework for identifying and prioritizing NWA opportunities, referred to as the NWA suitability criteria. The proposed framework determines NWA suitability by looking at three elements: the type of infrastructure project, the required timeline, and the project cost. The utility subsequently filed utility-specific versions of the NWA suitability criteria that adapts this common framework to each utility's distinct characteristics. While the proposed NWA suitability criteria has the potential of broadening the pool of projects for which NWAs will be considered, it is still unclear how the suitability criteria will be incorporated into the utility's system planning procedures. Additionally, the utilities have not indicated how and when the criteria will be applied to projects in their current capital plans and the procurement process for obtaining additional NWAs. To address the NWA shortcomings, the order provides guidance in several areas and directs the utilities to file revised utility-specific NWA criteria and other specific information within 60 days. The next topic addressed is privacy standards for aggregated customer data. Just as provision of system data is imperative to facilitating DERs, provision of customer data is also important to enable building owners, DER developers, and customers to make informed investment decisions that improve energy efficiency and support other REV goals. However, while significant benefits can be derived from customer data, protecting customers' privacy is essential. In the supplemental DSIP, the utilities propose a universal 1515 privacy standard that would keep customers' identities anonymous when aggregated data sets are provided to third parties. With this standard, an aggregated set of customer consumption data may be shared without explicit approval from each customer involved only if the data set contains at least 15 customers, with no single customer representing more than 15% of the total load for the group. The draft order accepts the utility's proposed use of a 1515 privacy standard for most use cases involving aggregated sets of customer consumption data. However, the order also acknowledges concerns that in certain circumstances, the 1515 standard might be more conservative than necessary and could prove to be too cumbersome and restrictive. To address those concerns, the order directs each utility or utility data service to track all requests for aggregated customer data and be prepared to report on the number of requests that do not clear the 1515 standard. There are also legitimate concerns that the 1515 privacy standard would unduly hamper building energy management and benchmarking in particular. Therefore, the draft order directs the utilities to work with staff and stakeholders to develop an alternative approach and standard that addresses those concerns and to submit that within 90 days. Finally, with regard to the utilities' plan for integrating energy storage, the supplemental DSIP acknowledges that energy storage could play more than one role in the future, including by increasing hosting capacity. However, the utilities thus far have advanced a limited number and variety of energy storage projects and have provided little information on how they plan to integrate the various forms and applications of storage on a routine basis. Energy storage will play a key role in advancing the REV objectives, as more and more renewables are integrated into the grid, and the utility should help facilitate energy storage on the grid. Consequently, this order directs the utilities to increase the scope and speed of their energy storage efforts. Specifically, no later than by December 31st, 2018, each individual utility is directed to have energy storage projects deployed and operating at no fewer than 2 separate distribution substations or feeders. Furthermore, the utility should strive to perform at least 2 types of grid functions with the deployed energy storage resources, such as increasing hosting capacity or reducing peak load. The utility should collaborate to avoid duplicative projects and ensure that they collectively deploy the fullest range of available energy storage technologies and applications that are potentially productive in New York State. In conclusion, the DSIP filings clearly indicate that the utilities are making progress toward developing the DSP. The near-term actions required by the draft order are intended to promote more timely implementation of necessary tools and dissemination of critical information that will better facilitate DER integration into the grid and further progress DSP development. I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay. Thank you, Tammy. Both this conversation and our conversation about value of D is, I think, really timely because, as we often talk about our motivations around energy efficiency and clean energy, but there's also an entire economic development aspect of this that I think we need to be prepared for. And today, and I don't believe it's fake news, Smart Grid published a report that Navigant put together for the advanced energy economy, which actually did a study of the impact of the changes in the advanced energy economy. And I think it's really noteworthy because the period they covered was for 2011 to 2016, so just a little bit of overlap with REV. And what they concluded is that as it stands today, the advanced energy economy industry, which includes clean energy as well as smart buildings, as well as EVs, so anything that we normally talk about when we talk about smart grid, is now worth $200 billion in the U.S. and $1.4 trillion worldwide. So it gives you a sense of how fast this is growing and why it's so important for New York to lead in this direction. Because not only does it allow us to keep pace, but it, more importantly, and we're seeing this in a lot of the businesses that are created in New York, it's a huge driver of economic development. There are 3 million jobs that have been associated now, that have been developed over the last couple of years in this clean energy economy. So to put it in perspective, according to the report, in 2016, revenue with clean energy was equal to domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing. It approached where we are on wholesale consumer electronics. And to me, the most stunning aspect of this, it was nearly double beer sales in the U.S. So the point here is that, we started REV because we understood that technology wasn't the issue. It was really that we needed to change the structure of managing the industry. And that really important part of it was that there were going to be a lot of things happening at the distribution level that could make the system much more efficient, and that utilities could take advantage of the advancements in smart buildings as well as other distributed energy resource technologies to run a system that was much more dynamic and could really then become a partner, but that we also knew it wasn't just going to happen because people invested in things behind the meter. We really needed a whole different approach to designing and operating the distribution system. So the distribution system integration planning process was around both identification of what that new architecture needed to look like, and then what was a way to get there. I think that the order does a very nice job of identifying many of the things that are going to be critical gating aspects to get the utilities to a position where we're able to have the same kind of situational awareness, control capability, the ability to use distributed resources in a most effective way than that we're going to need for the future. And so things like hosting capability, to me, are very important. I think the order talks about the need for the utilities to really identify that roadmap. I would like to take it to the next level. How do we use these resources? How do we really create a transactional grid? Understanding, though, we have to take this first step of really understanding what we're going to need could do on a static basis before we can get to a dynamic basis. But I hope that, we'll get there soon. The other aspect, I think, of the order around data sharing continues to be a very important aspect. We are simply not going to be able to get just investment in this grid if people have to invest blindly. They absolutely need to know where the right places are. It's one thing to send price signals, but if they don't really understand where the needs are, they're going to make the wrong decisions. And so the value of D order and the DSIP order really need to go hand in hand in terms of getting third parties to put money at risk. That reduces the burden on ratepayers, but it gives them the ability to identify the best places to put those resources in. And I think getting that data sharing is very important. Lastly, the issue of storage that's also addressed in the order. Without question, energy storage is a very, very important part of our future. I did want to note the same report talks about the fact that in 2016, energy storage revenue grew 54%. So it's now at a $427 million revenue in the U.S., and EVs are also growing. And, I've talked to many people in this market. Certainly Governor Cuomo has made a huge commitment to charging stations, and we believe that electric vehicles have a big place in New York's future, and we can create a great industry around that. So all of this means that we really need to get with it. I think that what this order does in the DSIPs is accelerate and puts the right pressure on the utilities to advance the ball further. I think they've made good progress, but we need to make a lot more progress quickly, and the order points it in the right direction. Like the value of D, I think that the DSIP process is going to grow as we have more third parties in the market they're going to put pressure on the utilities to get more to help create the businesses. And I think then with the utilities, we'll get smarter about serving those needs. So I think this all is working at the right level, but for someone like me, it's never fast enough, but I think it's pretty darn quick. So with that, I intend to vote for the order, and we'll turn it over to Commissioner Sayre.
In my view of the future of the distribution network, which may be subject to change due to technological developments, the distributed system platform is going to play an absolutely key central role in the enabling and the dispatch and the compensation of behind-the-meter distributed energy resources. For this model to work, the potential players in the DER market need a lot of information to help them figure out how they can compete, where they can compete, and how they can make money, which is, of course, the American way. The way we envision DERs being integrated into the distribution networks is through the utilities' distributed system implementation plans, the DSIPs, that are the subject of this order. Some of the things the DER providers have to know are where is it going to be difficult to deploy these resources because of system constraints, where it's going to be beneficial to deploy these resources because of system needs, exactly how they're going to be interfacing with the DSPs, how they can participate in the utility sourcing of non-wires alternatives, and how we're going to set the appropriate balance between giving the DER providers the data they need and protecting consumer privacy in their own individual data. In response to our previous orders, the utilities have indeed filed DSIPs and supplemental DSIPs. This order determines that the marketplace needs more information and provides direction to utilities on what we need most immediately and when. It also establishes a basic rule of how much aggregation of consumer information will be required to anonymize individual customer information, but of course, customers will always be free to release their own information to anyone they choose. The utilities and other stakeholders have worked extremely hard on the DSIPs and supplemental DSIPs, and this order should not be taken as criticism of those efforts. There are some extremely encouraging elements of the DSIPs that lead us to believe we're going in the right direction. I view this order as a supplement and not by any means a change in direction, and I commend the utilities and staff and the stakeholders for the heavy lifting that they've done so far. There are a lot of details in this order, but the two things that really jump out to me that I'd like to highlight. First, we're directing a much more granular level of information regarding the hosting capacity of the network, as has always been explained, and we're establishing due dates for the additional data. We're also directing the utilities to work with each other and adopt to the extent possible each other's best practices. And among those, I'd call out National Grid's online portal and interactive maps. And second is the battery part of the order. Every utility is directed to deploy by the end of 2018 at least 2 energy storage projects. I guess it doesn't need to be physical batteries, but it needs to be energy storage at no fewer than 2 separate locations, and to perform at least 2 types of grid functions, such as increasing hosting capacity and peak load reduction. And it should be noted that for the utilities who are ahead of the curve, we will count storage incorporated into non-wires alternatives and REV demonstration projects as compliant with this requirement. What we're addressing here is what we've decided is needed right now. The order doesn't cover everything in the DSIPs. It doesn't cover every issue raised by the parties. But what it basically does is move the ball forward another 10 yards toward the goal line. In the future, we're going to be using that fresh set of downs, and you can expect us to continue to refine the DSIPs as we go into the future. Thanks.
Doing Australian rules football.
So when I look at this draft order, from my perspective, the way I kind of look at it is that we had a directive to the utilities to really do 3 types of filings. The first was the planning timeline for the stakeholder engagement on the DSIPs. Then the second was the initial individual DSIPs to be filed, and then the third was the joint submission of the DSIPs. And so staff has now looked at it and at them and wanted to give clear guidance with commission approval of what that guidance was on some of the items that were in the DSIPs. It's not a blessing by the staff of everything that's in the DSIPs that's not discussed today, and it's not a blessing by the commission of everything that's in the DSIPs as all good systems go. Nor is it not being happy with what's being submitted, but really at this point it seemed that what was necessary was clear established order that gives that further guidance on 5 things. And like has been said, the first is the hosting capacity, which was really just a specific nod that they needed to do more. Then we have the interconnection portals, again, a specific nod that they need to do more. The third was the non-wires alternatives and giving some more meat on the bone to what that is and focusing on that aspect of it. The fourth was the aggregate data privacy, which is different from the data sharing aspects. Those are separate issues, though they're interrelated, but to the extent that there is data privacy and needing to set some clear standard there, and understanding that there is some tension on what that standard, whether it's too conservative of a standard. That's why we were going to take comments on that shortly after to look at that. And then the fifth, which is I think the biggest, is on the energy storage, which is really a directive to the utilities that they should do at least 2 energy storage projects. In my mind, that's sort of the biggest part of this and the one that's the most challenging, because what that is or isn't may be subject to debate. There's the way I see it, and I look to Mr. Warden or Ms. Mitchell to focus on in that the 3 ways that a utility can look to do the energy storage as envisioned in this order.
So, as you notice, there's 3 ways they can go forward with an energy storage project. One of the ways is they could do it as part of a demonstration project, which is something actually that Con Edison is already pursuing. Those things, the demo process is already well established, and the utilities all know how to proceed within that, and it's all within the framework of what's been set up previously. The other way is through a non-wires alternative. So, theoretically, if they can find an opportunity where they can avoid some distribution infrastructure investment, and they can use DER along with energy storage to avoid that cost, and they can do it within the current budget, what they have for their CapEx budgets, they can do it within that framework that's already established in their rate case. The third way would be is if they come up with something that goes above and beyond either the NWA or the demonstration projects, they could come back and file a petition with the Commission for separate funding. My personal preference is that it would be an NWA process, something that they can learn and use to defer some construction, but we may well see other opportunities as well. I think we should keep in mind that we're looking at this energy storage as a little bit of a kickstart to get all utilities some baseline information on using energy storage to help with their NWA work going forward, and just learning how to integrate more DER into their system.
Okay. We had a technical conference on energy storage back in May of 2016. A separate proceeding, I believe, was opened on that technical conference. I think it was an all-day proceeding. I don't believe that we have really put a mark on what we're doing on energy storage until today, so that this really is a nod about energy storage being a potential critical, valuable asset for ensuring that we have sufficient reliability, and also as it goes hand in hand with the hosting capacity to really integrate and potentially achieve a higher penetration of DER. To the extent that energy storage and what that specifically means is similar to a microgrid or other things, right? That not everybody is necessarily on the same page of what that means and exactly who should be involved in it and how it should link. So I just do caution that we do, while energy storage is a vital asset, we do need to look carefully at how that is integrated into the system, and to the extent of how we really look at the different issues, especially as it relates to capacity constraints and the demands on the system, as well as other players in the market that may be looking at other things that they're doing that ties into with energy storage. So I do caution that we really need to keep a careful eye and look at the different issues and the lessons learned from that while we're going through it, and make sure that we stick to the framework of this in the distribution system. The FERC has a NOPR on energy storage, and how DER in the distribution market fits and aligns with the wholesale market is something that's very important. So to the extent that this energy storage is not about the wholesale market, but to the extent that, like with the Value D, the integration of these emerging DERs and how they interconnect is, I think, very important. And we need to make sure that we work carefully through those challenges, and also work with the parties that are involved in energy storage and other things that will interconnect. Because the most important thing from my perspective is the reliability and resiliency of our systems, and making sure that we are carefully planning, working with the ISO as well as others, state energy planning that needs to happen, as well as the state resource plan. I think are all very, very important, and we need to be careful on that. As it relates to being in a REV demo, I also am cautious in terms of making sure that we are carefully looking at it, incorporating and coming to the Commission as necessary and as appropriate to carefully get specific Commission direction on aspects of it, and that we don't move them inappropriately into a REV demo, and to the extent that it can be done within the CapEx funding as well, I think is important to try to look at. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Berman. Do you have anything further? So I do want to pick up on your comment, though, about the relationship between hosting capability and energy storage. I agree with you that the two are highly interrelated, and one of the things that I think is very important is for the utilities to truly understand how they can use fast responding storage. Storage, there's multiple flavors. I mean, thermal storage is certainly very important as we consider to look at thermal efficiency and other forms of storage like fuel cells, etc. But particularly when it comes to battery storage and how utilities might want to deploy battery storage or could deploy battery storage to increase the value of clean energy, particularly solar and wind, on their system, both on the high side and behind the meter, I think is very important. And while the demos are all around business models and how the utilities might want to innovate on business models, I think the DSIPs are more about technology deployment. And I concur with Mike's observation that really what we want to start trying to understand is how storage can be used to avoid other types or complement other types of investment on the system. And I don't think there's any other way to learn that except doing it. And so the intent here, from my perspective, is to give all the utilities the experience, both not just in working with storage companies, but how storage can be used so that the control system operators actually see it on the grid and get a better understanding of how it might work. And that, to us, then from there, we'll be a lot smarter in how we can deploy it and in what business models make the most sense. But it really is going to take some experience, and I think that the order really recognizes that piece of it. Certainly we can learn from other states in this direction where utilities who've had experience with storage are now able to see much more quickly just where it can come up with a solution, where before they might have chosen something else simply because they were uncertain about how it would actually operate. So with that, I think it's a very important piece, and to tie those two. And I am ready to move to a vote. And I'm on cold medicine, so, you'll have to excuse me. I may not remember what I said 5 seconds ago. So item number 202, which is in the manner of the distribution system implementation plans. All those in favor of the recommendation to direct the filings related to the DSIPs as described, please indicate by saying aye.
And I concur based on my comments at session and past voting history.
Okay, and I say aye as well, so hearing no opposition, there being none, the recommendations are adopted. I'm finally getting it from my last session, Paul. So third item for discussion is item 201, and that relates to the interconnection earnings adjustment mechanism. Mike Warden is going to be presenting that today. And before I move on to that, I did want one thing. The DSIP filings are very voluminous and they're very technical. And I don't think while we're describing how we want to move forward, I do want to recognize the work of the OEJW staff in looking at those, working with utilities, digesting them, and helping identify a path forward. I think you guys did a great job on these. I know there's a lot of people involved, and this is the first time through for us to look at these filings. So it's Tammy and your team has done a terrific job, so thank you. Mike, should we just move to the EAMs? Is that you or
That's me.
Marco?
Is that all right?
Looked like you were trying to pass it to Marco for a
Nah.
second.
No, not Marco. I would like to, if I can indulge you, I would like to say that the work on the DSIPs was a multi-office experience, and they had quite a team together going through these things. They were voluminous, and a lot of work went into it besides my staff as well. So appreciate the work
Thanks.
from the other offices.
Thanks, Mike.
So item 201 is the interconnection earnings adjustment mechanism, and so this is your last regular item before this commission, and I can only assume I'm doing it because you wanted to finish on a high note.
That's right. And with you.
So there you go. So the Track 2 order back on May 19, 2016 laid out a regulatory and rate-making framework for moving the REV process forward. One of the key elements of that order was the introduction of earnings adjustment mechanisms intended to drive utility performance going forward through a diverse, balanced set of incentives. There were 4 categories of outcome-based incentives discussed in that order: system efficiency, energy efficiency, consumer engagement, and interconnection. So interconnection EAM, why are we doing that right now? I think that was a priority at the time because of the issues we were having last spring, which you're all well aware of regarding DG applications, the timing of them, the number of them, caused by Scott, in my opinion. More to come. And there's more to come. But, we had some issues. We've talked about them before. Not to diminish, the commission actually had some very positive policies that it put forth, but it created a stress on the utility system for processing the applications. So there's 3 specific components identified in the Track 2 order for the interconnection EAM. The first is that the utilities would have to meet Commission SIR or standardized interconnection requirements to be eligible for an EAM. The second was to develop an interconnection survey. The survey was going to be the key element in deciding or evaluating whether the utilities were doing a good job. And there was a third element for an analysis of failed applications. So the utilities were directed to file specifics for the interconnection EAMs. So I'd like to make a couple of observations about EAMs a little more generalized first. The interconnections had an earlier deadline, as I mentioned, because of the processing of DG applications. We've done a number of things, and I won't go through the whole litany. There is literally a litany of things we've been doing to work on those things, but we created, at the chair's direction, the Interconnection Technical Working Group, the Interconnection Policy Working Group, and we created an ombudsman position both at the department and at NYSERDA. Those processes have really been very positive in terms of getting developers and utilities in the same room to work through some of the issues. We had the recent queuing order, which with the value of D order now is going to allow us to reset a lot of the queues where we have interconnection processes kind of stacked up at this time, and they're just waiting so that they can now move forward and we can decide which projects really are going to end up getting built and which ones aren't. So I want to point out as well that there's a lot of interest by various parties in the development of EAMs, not only with regards to interconnection, but other EAMs. The first EAMs, so this is not the first time you've taken action regarding EAMs besides the policy order. The Coniston rate case developed the first set of actual EAMs, which you voted on in January. And so, I like to tell people when we talk about those EAMs as they're kind of like the second starting point for EAMs. The first starting point obviously was the policy order. The second starting point was the Coniston rate case, but that's not the be-all, end-all. And this continues to be an area not only for interconnection but other EAMs that we need to continue to work forward. So stepping back to the interconnection EAM, the utilities made their filing on September 2nd, 2016. It offered really, in my mind, a framework and a process for creating and applying the interconnection EAM. It was based entirely on completed applications. So in order to be part of the process, an application would have to be complete, meaning the process, the project would have to be in service. They recommended going through a baseline and a testing process to develop questions which were, the appropriate questions to use going forward. And they also recommended a 50 kW minimum as was directed in the commission order. So we received comments principally from New York City and IREC, and they really highlighted 3 particular sets of comments. First was they thought that we should be addressing more than just the projects that were above 50 kW. Second, they felt like it needed more developer input. And third, they needed to use more than just completed applications. So in this order, the first thing I will say and mention is that we recommend that you stick with the 50 kW limit. And the reason for that is the issues we've been having with regards to processing applications had everything to do with the projects above 50 kW. In fact, mostly above 300 kW, up to 2 megawatts. That's really the area that was more problematic. Those are more difficult applications. They require a lot more energy or engineering analysis. Projects under 50 kW are largely processed much like you could put in an application to get a service at your house, and they are working very well. Staff does monitor this stuff on a monthly basis. If we find that there are issues, Regarding the less than 50 kW ones, we would certainly come back to you and recommend further action. So what the order before you recommends is that we modify the JU's proposed incentive to reiterate and make very clear that the SIR guidelines or requirements from the Commission are a threshold. They're not going to be subject to incentives, so we shouldn't incent utilities for complying with Commission orders. It seems pretty straightforward, but it just keeps coming up. And it came up so many times, we just thought it was best to reiterate that point. The order also directs the JU, the Joint Utilities, to have a proposal for a midpoint survey in the revised filing so that DG developers who are going through some of the early parts of the process are able to provide input as to how the process is working for them. It also clarifies that there will be essentially a statewide framework. So the idea here is there's going to be a baseline statewide, and then there can be unique attributes or aspects that apply to a given utility territory. But there would be a base starting point for the entire state. And then finally, it directs the utilities to review and collect data regarding failed, withdrawn, or abandoned applications. Now, we think at this time, the way the Track 2 order was written originally, that would be part of the EAM where they could potentially earn money associated with that. We think until they work through this queuing process with the number of applications that are going to get kicked out, that we think they just need to do an analysis of that, learn from what happened during this process, during this kind of interim time period with this requeuing, restacking of the queue and all that kind of stuff, do a full evaluation because there are definitely lessons to be learned here. And then we will revisit the question of whether the failed application should be part of a formal EAM going forward. So those are really the highlights of what we're doing today, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Mike. So the way the order contemplates this is the next step, but that I assume the chapter is not closed. We would expect to see additional work on this.
So yes,
mechanism.
I neglected to say we expect the order requires the utilities to make a joint filing in 60 days. And then what will happen is it'll start getting integrated into individual rate proceedings or parts of rate proceedings. Con Edison has established a collaborative within its rate case that was approved by you, and that requires them to come back with a proposal. That actual proposal will come back for the Commission before it's fully implemented. So it'll be part of a process going forward.
So, when we established in the Track 2 order that we would have an incentive mechanism around interconnection, it really wasn't just about process and compliance with process. So I certainly concur with your observation that it was certainly never, at least my intent, and I don't think it's clear in the order, that we were never looking to incent utilities just to comply with standards. The real intent here around the interconnection is about the fact that in going forward in the future, creating this platform it's two-way, and that the utilities ought to think about distributed energy resources as customers, and that ought to be as they are with respect to any company and its customer, finding ways to exceed their customer's expectation. And with the view that if a utility can become an attractive market for distributed energy resource providers to want to participate in that market, that benefits end-use customers because the utilities are enabling that market to develop. And so the mechanism is really a way for utilities to see that they are satisfying the customers so that the DER provider is not a competitor to the utility, but actually someone that the utilities care about and they want to attract to the market. So certainly measuring time for interconnection and things like that are important. But I think moving forward, it's going to be equally important that utilities understand what a DER provider will need to facilitate their business to get the cost of doing business down, and that just as any other business wants to satisfy their customers, that the utilities will see these as customers that they want to get high marks of approval from. So I'm hoping that this is, I think, a good start for where we're trying to drive this, and to really change this business model. And I think it's important to continually reinforce that we are creating a change in the business such that DER providers are truly customers of the utility, and the utility wants to attract them to their service areas. So with that, I'm going to vote for the order, and I'll be watching in the future to see how all this develops. So thank you.
We'll endeavor to give Australia a good lesson.
Yeah.
In our Rev Track 2 order, we explained that we are going to be increasingly implementing our REV principles in the course of individual utility rate cases, and taking steps to incorporate these outcome-based earnings mechanisms rather than relying on the nearly 100-year-old rate of return model, at least as an exclusive way of setting rates. So this order is part of that transition. We will, it sets out an example of how we would like to see these mechanisms work in future rate cases. Under the mechanisms, we'll increasingly be establishing REV-like outcomes that we expect the utilities to achieve, and we'll be prepared to give them a carrot if they beat our expectations, and ultimately give them a stick if they miss them. These EAMs have to be carefully crafted, of course, to meet the situation of each utility in each rate case, but we are able to set some guidelines that we want to apply statewide, and that's what we're doing in this order for one category of EAMs, the interconnection of distributed generation resources. You've already heard the specifics of the order from Mr. Warden and Chair Zibelman, and I won't go into those, but I think it's sufficient for me to say that we're starting down what is going to be a long and productive road of reforming our rate case process to provide incentives to achieve desired results in the form of outcome improvements compared to the way we set rates now. And for that reason, I'm very happy to support the order.
Thank you. Commissioner Berman?
I really have no comments. I want to just say that I'm glad that the process has been and continues to be fine-tuned as necessary, and that I think this is an attempt to do that and continue to work on that. So I'm supportive. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's move to a vote. All those, and by the way, this is my last vote on a regular agenda. All those in favor of the recommendation to direct filings related to interconnection earnings adjustment mechanisms as described, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All three. We should just continue like this.
Let's move along.
There being no opposition, the recommendations are adopted. Thank you. I know. Okay. I was just relishing the moment. It is the cold meds. But I'm down to my last cough drop, so I got to move along. We're going to move to the consent agenda. Do any of the commissioners want to recuse from voting on any of the items on the consent agenda? No. Okay. Are there any comments or questions on the consent agenda? Mr. Berman.
So I just have one comment on item 372, is the community net metering item, which seeks to look at the 10-member requirement and waive that requirement. We're waiving it in very limited fashion to properties that have multiple residential units, but for all others, it remains as the 10-member requirement. There was concern that this 10-member requirement was a barrier, an obstacle to expanding on-site solar and was preventing access to opportunities, especially in the urban area and the low and moderate income area. To the extent that I did not vote for the original item. I focused on whether or not it was appropriate to move from a 10-member requirement, which I had concerns on initially that might be a barrier, to now lower. So to the extent that I also am concerned about whether that 10-member requirement was too low, and what we were actually doing with that. I have struggled with what that means for this item. I did look at, there was a low-income collaborative that was done based on the community DG order, and it didn't address this issue in particular. It was focused on looking at what the barriers were. This came out through the phase 1 process of the order, which was supposed to look at helping for 20% towards community DG for low income. So I am in favor of the item to the extent that there is concern that this is a barrier. I am concerned that this is not necessarily a barrier, and that this may also present some other challenges. However, since in the value D order, we recognize the need for the low-income collaborative in some fashion to continue, and my comments really are focused more on making sure this does not fall away, and that to the extent that people did spend a lot of time on the low-income collaborative and drilling down on issues and the need to make sure that when we're looking at all different issues that we try to align and take all of the work and not forget about it. So that's all.
Great. Thank you. So now we'll move to a vote. Thanks for your comments. All those in favor of the recommendations on the consent agenda, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Hearing no opposition or there being none, the recommendations are adopted. Thank you. Okay. Before we close today, it's obvious this is my last session, and I actually, one of the things I'd like to do, because there's been a lot of questions about this, is what does it mean when the commission moves down to 2 members? So I did ask our general counsel, Paul, to maybe provide us and everybody a quick briefing on his review of that. Thanks, Paul. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let's begin with the Public Service Law authorizes a full membership of 5 members for the Public Service Commission. There is a general law in effect. It's called Section 41 of the General Construction Law, and that law would ordinarily require that there be a majority of the whole number of 5 members to constitute a quorum. So if you do the math on that, a majority of 5 equals 3. So if you applied the general law, you would need a quorum of 3 people. But 6 years after the general law was enacted, it was identified that applying that law to the Public Service Commission could be a problem and have crippling effects because the commission has many important functions that are time sensitive. So the Public Service Law was amended to provide a special exception so that for the commission, a quorum is measured by a majority of the duly appointed commissioners. So we currently have 3 duly appointed commissioners. Therefore, a majority of 3 is 2 if you do the math. And upon the departure of Chair Zibelman, the commission will have 2 duly appointed and highly experienced commissioners. And if you do the math there, a majority of 2 is 2. So it will be necessary for both remaining commissioners to both vote in the affirmative to take any action. The only problem going forward is that there will be no opportunity for a recusal and the commission taking action on an item. But other than that, as long as the 2 agree, the commission will be able to function. Any questions?
I thank you for that. I do know that there is, that's as the counsel to the commission, that's the council's position, and I do know that there is some uncertainty on that from others. So to the extent that that's helpful information. I appreciate it, and I do hope that this is a short transition.
Okay. And the people who have uncertainty, I'm sure, have not read the legislative history. It makes it very clear in the memos that were part of the bill jacket that this was the intent of the special exception. So I don't have the least bit of concern about how we're going to apply this.
I certainly have confidence in your opinion, although I would say that if you were in private practice, you would have probably said that the majority of 5 is 4 or something like that, just to add the minutes that you get to bill. So with that, first of all, as many of you probably have seen, Governor Cuomo has asked Commissioner Sayre to become the interim chair of the commission, which I'm assuming you accepted. So.
If not previously stated, yes, I do.
Okay, so this is my last day, and this time next week I will be looking out at the Yarra River in Melbourne and thinking about you guys, although I'll be thinking about you tomorrow, because it'll be tomorrow by the time you get to today. But I will be thinking about you, and I will be missing you greatly. And so I am going to handle the gavel over to Chairman Sayre to close the meeting.
Well, we're not going to close it immediately. I have a few remarks to make and a few things to offer. Thank you very much, Chair Zibelman. It's been my pleasure and honor to serve with you, and it's my honor and privilege to be named to serve as interim chair. Thanks to your tenacious leadership, this commission has somehow been able to put into place all of the fundamental building blocks necessary for the implementation of REV. I could name all of these orders and initiatives and actions under REV, but I decided not to ask the staff to compile them because you would miss your flight to Australia if I did. Changing the basic model of energy in New York has also meant changing the way we approach energy regulation and the creation of REV for the past 3 years. We've done 15 or more, I think it's more, REV-related proceedings. We've undertaken them nearly all simultaneously, and that's been a marvel of organizational and managerial skill on your part. New York has benefited from your extensive knowledge and your world-class credentials as an expert in energy policy, and we've been blessed by your enthusiasm for what anyone would recognize as an absolutely monumental task. Chair Zibelman has taken the message of REV across the country while keeping all of the pieces of REV moving forward. The staff has responded magnificently, and I know you and the rest of us appreciate all the work that has brought us here today. And though we won't have you as leader and chair of the Public Service Commission, our work continues. The full implementation and further refinement of REV lies before us, promising new markets and new opportunities for energy savings here in New York, and the benefits that will come from a transactive grid focused on the consumer and the jobs that we can create in distributed energy resources and a clean, green economy. The word legacy is perhaps too often used to describe personal and professional accomplishments, but a legacy is exactly what you are leaving to the state of New York, and I am proud to have been a part of it. As interim chair, I look forward to continuing this great work. In my first action as an interim chair, I would like to introduce a resolution that expresses our appreciation and gratitude for your dedication, inspiration, vision, and leadership that you graced us with during your tenure as chair. This one might fit into an overhead bin. The next one won't. I move to have this resolution included into the record in full, but I'm going to summarize it right now. Whereas Audrey Zibelman was confirmed as Commissioner in June 2013 and has served as Chair and CEO of the Department of Public Service since September 3, 2013 with great distinction. And whereas Chair Zibelman has put her extensive expertise to work for New Yorkers, drawing on 3 decades of experience across the utility industry. And whereas Chair Zibelman led the groundbreaking work of this commission to transform the retail electric industry through its Reforming the Energy proceeding to provide New York consumers with cleaner, more renewable, resilient, reliable, and affordable electric service. And whereas this commission has issued approximately 2,400 orders under her leadership, which have included landmark decisions establishing a statewide program to make energy more affordable for low-income consumers, the adoption of the Clean Energy Standard to promote clean and renewable energy resources, achieving significant benefits for New York customers as conditions to major telecommunications company mergers, strengthening natural gas safety through enforcement actions by the Department and the Commission, and championing water conservation alternatives in addition to all of the transformational decisions in reforming the energy vision. Whereas Chair Zibelman inspired historic levels of public participation and stakeholder collaboration in the work of the department as evidenced by 99,454 public comments and 81,903 documents filed with the Commission during her tenure, numerous public forums and technical conferences, including a joint conference with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission on matters of mutual interest regarding New York energy infrastructure and markets. And whereas Chair Zibelman has been widely recognized for her leadership and innovation, as demonstrated by the many accolades she has received, including Policymaker of the Year by Utility Dive in 2016, the top 10 most influential leaders in the electric industry since 1990 by the Public Utilities Fortnightly, again in 2016, and the Demand Response and Smart Grid Leadership Award in 2014, among several others. And whereas Chair Zibelman has challenged and inspired department staff through her strong and thoughtful leadership mixed with good humor and compassion, and shall be dearly missed by all those who worked with her, who will continue the work that she began as she embarks down under to transform a continent. It is resolved that the New York State Public Service Commission expresses its deepest appreciation to Audrey Zibelman for her leadership as chair of this commission, chief executive officer of the department, and her faithful service to the citizens of the state of New York as demonstrated by her unwavering commitment to the mission of the Commission to ensure safe, secure, and reliable access to electric, gas, steam, telecommunications, and water services for all of New York's residential and business consumers. I would call for a vote on the incorporation of that resolution into the record. Aye.
Thank you.
I'm not done yet.
You're not done yet? Thanks. He's not done yet.
And wait, there's more. This one will not go into the overhead bin.
Wow. What's that?
NARUC.
Oh, wow.
I have a second resolution to offer into the record. This is a resolution adopted by the Board of Directors of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, otherwise NARUC. I move that it be incorporated into the record in full, and I will again hit some of the high points. Whereas Audrey Zibelman was confirmed as Commissioner of the New York Public Service Commission in June 2013, and whereas Audrey Zibelman is most recognized internationally as a leader in creating greater value for consumers through the transactive grid, during her tenure at the New York PSC, she was instrumental in her role as chair with New York Governor Andrew M. Cuomo's enactment of the Reforming the Energy Vision Plan. The REV Plan has been recognized for its vision in seeking to transform the electric grid by successfully developing and implementing 21st century regulatory reform, with a steadfast focus on lowering the cost of energy for consumers while building a more resilient and reliable power system. And whereas Audrey Zibelman's focus on improving the electric grid for the benefit of a community can be traced to her 2 years in the Peace Corps in the late 1970s, where she worked in a village in Chad that had no electricity. Audrey saw firsthand how the lack of power exacerbated poverty and was thereafter dedicated to helping to be a part of positively transforming the energy world. And whereas a signature cornerstone of the REV plan under Audrey's tenure has been centered on how to work collaboratively with all stakeholders to improve New York's energy grid and find creative and innovative solutions, and whereas Audrey Zibelman has been recognized by her peers as a national and international expert in energy policy, markets, and smart grid innovation, and whereas Audrey Zibelman was known for dedicating her time, energy, and expertise to help promote REV discussions throughout the United States and internationally, her contributions and visionary insights help propel other similar REV actions outside New York. And as one of the architects of REV, Audrey Zibelman was called upon to participate in countless national conversations on these issues to provide the regulatory perspective. And whereas Audrey Zibelman will be greatly missed by the Committee on Electricity and her NARUC and Mid-Atlantic Conference of Regulatory Utilities Commissioners colleagues, who are honored to have served with her as she zealously advanced her vision for the energy of the future with passion and hard work. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Board of Directors of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners convened at its 2017 Winter Committee meetings in Washington, D.C., extends and expresses its deepest and sincerest appreciation and gratitude to Audrey Zibelman for her dedicated years of public service in advancing her vision for the energy of the future, and conveys to her its best wishes in all of her future endeavors, both professionally and personally. I move the incorporation in full of this resolution into the record. I vote aye. So be it. Now I'm done.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to be I'd like to be recognized. I'd like to be recognized, Chair Sayer, to say a few words.
Fire away.
Okay, thanks. Before we look backwards, before we look forward, I think we need to look backwards. And in 2007, and don't worry, I won't go through the whole history, but in 2007, Governor Hughes succeeded in obtaining historic passage of legislation creating the Public Service Commission of New York State, and thus the complex and often unpopular job of utility regulation was delegated. 1907, what did I say? 2007. Oh, all right.
It was a short.
It was a short, right? Let me start over. Thank you, Paul. In 2007, Governor Hughes succeeded in obtaining the passage of legislation creating the Public Service. Did I say it again?
It's my fault.
It was a joke. In 1907. Anyway, the system of utility regulation established in New York was eventually adopted nationally. And now in 2017, we, as the Commission, celebrate our 110th anniversary. Truly is historic. In 1907, as now, the Public Service Commission's fundamental responsibility was to safeguard the public interest in utility services, essential both to the welfare of our citizens and the economy of our state. Ultimately, the Commission is responsible for ensuring that these essential and necessary services are available in whatever quantities are necessary to meet all residential, commercial, and industrial demands now and in the future, as well as ensuring that they are provided efficiently and at reasonable cost. The Department of Public Service is the staff arm for the Public Service Commission. The Commission regulates the electric, gas, steam, telecommunications, cable, and water utilities in New York State. It has a broad mandate to ensure that consumers receive safe and reliable utility service at reasonable rates and with the least adverse effects upon the environment. The critical importance of the Commission's mission to the economic well-being of the state and its citizens cannot be overstated. The Commission stands at the intersection of the public need for virtually essential services and the private needs of the shareholder to ensure continued investment in these services. As such, The Commission occupies an incredibly important and unique role in balancing these interests in a way that ensures the most advanced and reliable services, while at the same time ensuring they are effectively and efficiently delivered. The Commission has navigated this weighty responsibility over the years effectively, and at the same time assumed a leadership role in developing innovative policies in both the energy and telecommunications areas. Our collective experiences at both NARUC and within the agency and the Commission show us that the New York Commission is generally the leader and pioneer on so many fronts. The Commission also has a longstanding commitment to substantive decision-making and fairness, supported by a highly professional and excellent staff. As then Chair Paul Goya said in his 1982 message on our 75th anniversary, and it is still true today, as we look toward the future, one thing is clear: the Commission will continue to face difficult challenges in all areas of regulation. Now, for 110 years, the Public Service Commission has been charged with the responsibility of safeguarding essential utility services, and the Commission and the department that supports this decision-making serve a key role in the future of the state, and it's important that our mission is supported. For me, as we look toward the next 110 years, it is imperative for all of us to look at our fundamental goals, our history, and the nature of our service to the people of New York, and from that, take stock of what our values are and need to be, and work together to achieve them. As Commissioner Sayer said, legacy, that's what we have today. Legacy, yes, is a very overused word these days. It seems that everyone and everything has to have one. But Chair Zibelman, it is true. You have left behind a very real legacy, which will affect the way we do things in New York for a very long time to come. On a personal level, every one of us who knew and knows Audrey and has worked alongside her, whether things were going well or badly, will remember her visionary impact with great admiration and awe. When all is said and done, however much you like your work, it's the people that you meet in it that really matter. And colleagues like Audrey are something very special. You don't come across many of them, and when you do, they leave a lasting, indelible impression. Audrey is a true visionary, and I share her vision for bringing greater transparency and granularity to valuing distributed energy resources and to seeking to make our energy future a better one. While we have had our differences, and some have been quite legendary, those differences were mostly on process, and I have never questioned her sincere desire to empower customers and spur innovation at the retail level. I have learned much from Audrey, and I'm sure that the Australian electricity grid will be in reliable, if likely transformative hands. I congratulate her on her Rev legacy as chair of the New York State Public Service Commission, and I look forward to continued future work with my colleague, Interim Chair Greg Sayer, at the helm. Thank you.
So everyone's been sitting for a really, really long time. So first of all, thank you, Chairman Sayer. Thank you, Commissioner Berman. That was for your words. And I just to take a couple minutes, when I was given the opportunity by Governor Cuomo to take on the position of commissioner and then chair of the New York Public Service Commission, I truly felt that it would be the best job in the world, and I was not disappointed. And I was thinking about it. I've taken a few jobs in my life, and sometimes I was disappointed, but this time I was totally right in that the opportunity in New York to be able to, one, serve the citizens of the state and be part of this administration, and then to work alongside my colleagues in what we call the energy team, which not only includes the Department of Public Service and the Public Service Commission, but also NYSERDA under John Rhodes, NYPA under Gil Quiones, and LIPA over Tom Falcone, as well as, of course, the leadership of Richard Kaufman has been an amazing experience in terms of understanding how the forces of government working collectively can look to forward good. The other aspect of it that is certainly the welcoming aspect of New Yorkers. New Yorkers, I think, have like the worst reputation precedes you. This is my first time in New York. I lived 20 years in Minnesota, and I never had as deep conversations in Minnesota as you have in 5 minutes in a taxi in New York. It is the most open people, and the friendship that I've gained, not just at this agency, but among the many members of the people who come here, the stakeholders, as it's been incredible. And of course, as many of you know, I came here under rather unique circumstances because I came as sort of a different person than I thought I was ever going to be, and fortunately grew out of that quickly. But it was great at seeing the warmth and people welcome me after my accident. But mostly, I have to say, the opportunity to work with my fellow commissioners and just in terms of the acumen and the commitment. And as Diane said, we disagree. But we didn't disagree on one thing, which is the most important thing, is that the work we do is really critical and really important. And so the fact that we cared and we fought things through both behind the scenes and in front of the scenes sometimes was because we really, really cared about what we were doing, and we take this very seriously. And that to me was wonderful, and with Patty and Gary as well. And then, of course, the staff. And I've said this many times to people, and I feel like the staff of this commission is as good as any corporation I've ever worked in, certainly as good as any government agency. The people who come here and work their hearts out every day for New Yorkers to try to make the right decision. And even like today, where with respect to some of the decisions we made with Value of D, where we offered to the industry, tell us what you want to do. And frankly, it only took staff to actually sit down and write out the pathway. And their willingness to take the risk and do things has been incredible. I don't think Rev could have gotten done. I don't think any of the things we could have gotten done without the staff. And so while as sitting as chair, you get recognition, that it's not because of what I did. It's really what people did in this room and in this agency. So I accept all the recognition, but I accept it not on my behalf, but on behalf of everyone who's sitting here. And I would add to that to the people who work with us, because quite frankly, if people resisted along the way, we wouldn't have made the progress we did. So we are fortunate in New York, and and I've often said if we did everything we're doing today, and I'm sure I'm going to insult somebody, and we did it in Indiana, nobody would care. But because we're New York, and because of the leadership New York has shown historically in everything that it does, people pay attention, and it has big influence. And one of the things that, quite frankly, about Australia is that they did look at what we were doing in New York. They are looking at, how to make the world better. How do we think about energy strategy going forward? And while I'm not going to be a policymaker there, I do know that while I'm down under, I'll be looking up to see what you guys are doing. With regards to that too, let me just say I feel very much like the competency and the capability of the people of the department, the leadership that I know Chairman Sayre will show, and the leadership that Commissioner Berman continues to serve in passion will serve New York well. I have total confidence that we won't miss a beat. There's never an organization should be around a person. It's always around the organization. And one thing I have to say, we have a superb organization, and I've been very, very grateful to be part of it, and I'm going to miss everybody a great deal. So thank you all. Thank you for all of your help along the way, your guidance, and most of all, your friendship. So thank you.
Secretary Burgess, are there any other matters to come before the Commission this afternoon?
There are no further matters today. The next commission meeting is April 20th at 10:30 in Albany.
This meeting is adjourned.